Welcome to this conversation with Association of Theological Schools presidents and deans and the executive director of the Association of Theological Schools about the question of how theological schools are responding in this time of the COVID-19 public health emergency global pandemic that we have been living through, and the corresponding and related pandemic of our understanding and awareness of structural racism as it relates to our institutions, to our politics, to our culture, and to our context. And navigating these twin pandemics and how theological schools are discerning our vocations, our callings in the midst of this time is what this wonderful panel of friends and colleagues and guests have assembled to talk about. Our moderator really for this conversation, bringing his perspective and vision from across the Association of Theological Schools in the United States and Canada, more than, I think, 270 theological schools total, is Dr. Frank Yamada. And Dr. Yamada is the executive director of the Association of Theological Schools. I would invite you to take the floor now and share with us your perspective on this time and what you're seeing in theological schools.
Thank you, Deb. And just again, my congratulations on behalf of the Association of Theological Schools on this wonderful series of occasions here that are leading up to your installation and inauguration as the president of Eden Theological Seminary, a very distinguished institution and school. And you are a leader called for just such a time as this for Eden Theological Seminary. So thank you for the invitation. Again, to my very distinguished panelists, it is really my privilege to be able to moderate your voices and your perspectives in this panel. Let me offer just a few brief words about what we're seeing from the Association of Theological Schools with regard to the dual pandemics. Let's just talk first of all about the COVID-19 coronavirus global pandemic. Really, the way that we've thought about this over this year from 2020 to 2021, we just passed the anniversary, in fact, of the announcement by the World Health Organization of the global pandemic, of the coronavirus COVID-19 global pandemic. We really saw over the course of the year that schools moved through three distinct phases in responding to the pandemic. There was the first, what we might call the immediate response, which was characterized by really emergency online delivery and remote work for the schools. So there was these really quick pivots that schools made to go to remote learning, to take care of their staff in remote work, and to take care of their students as they were transitioning to various different kinds of places if they were in residence in schools. The second phase was really an intermediate set of responses. Over the courses of the summer and in the early fall, schools began to plan for what looked increasingly like a year of remote learning, of trying to figure out the balances of how to have some form of hybrid education. Hybrid meaning both in terms of engagements in synchronous and asynchronous spaces, but also how to manage staff, faculty, and students in these remote learning environments. The amount of care for the community within that time was so significant, but it was a time of planning for that year. And then as the fall began to progress, you began to see schools really thinking of the longer term impacts of what this might mean as the pandemic would eventually loosen its grip, which we're still in the middle of. But they began to set their sights on the longer term implications of the pandemic. Many schools were rethinking their strategic plans, their long-term viability, and adaptations to the unknowns of a post-COVID-19 pandemic world. This is in some ways too why, if I can share a bit of good news in the middle of that, why I think the Lilly Endowment has just announced and recently rolled out an $87.5 million initiative to support theological schools in their planning and implementations of these plans, because it was a recognition both by the ATS and by the Lilly Endowment that this is where schools were. They were in these planning phases of how to think of the long term with regard to their school's mission and their viability. Other couple of pieces of good news. There were a lot of presidents and deans who were very concerned about the enrollments for fall, but the data really supports that actually 54% of ATS schools saw enrollment increases for the fall of 2020, reversing a decade-long trend where only 45% of the ATS schools saw increases in enrollments annually over that past decade. Also, government programs like the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, and the more recent stimulus bill really helped to buffer some of the schools' more immediate financial concerns. But I think if we look to the takeaways of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic was really an accelerator and a magnifying glass. Let me explain that. It was an accelerator because it really sped up schools' need to innovate. One of the things that we heard from almost every president and dean was that initiatives that were considered to be innovative for their school, that they may have had very long conversations about how to implement these narrative or these innovations. For example, a comprehensive distance learning education for what was a traditionally residential school. Well, suddenly, both the faculties, the administration, and the students were very ripe for that innovation and were very affirming of the need for that innovation. So there was an openness to innovation that emerged in response to the pandemic. The pandemic also was a magnifying glass because it magnified the issues with which schools were already dealing. If schools were concerned about finances or declining enrollments, even with the little bit of reprieve in 2020, the pandemic is highlighting the importance of these urgent areas that schools must address going forward. In some ways, it's just put a magnifying glass on the importance of these issues and the fact that these issues were longstanding issues, but the school's urgency in needing to address them. With regard to the pandemic of systemic racism and white supremacy, unlike this coronavirus, there is nothing novel about the other pandemic, this other second pandemic. It is not new. It is part of the fabric and founding of our country, and the antecedent of US racism goes centuries, if not millennia, back to the twisted soul at the heart of European colonialism. In the summer of 2020, while in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, this second pandemic reached an inflection point with the killings of Black people, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. The summer of 2020 saw our nation dealing with the legacies of white supremacy and violence against people of color. It is, as I said, it was an inflection point. This was not a new phenomenon. It was just the most recent inflection point of this centuries-long pandemic within US society and culture. And there have been many more deaths. And as the past couple of days has shown us, the violence of white supremacy and systemic racism has captured the public's eye again with the killing of 8 women, all but one of Asian descent, at the hands of a white Caucasian Christian male. I haven't even mentioned the blatant white supremacy on display during the siege at the nation's capital in January. The responses in our society, of course, were wide and varied. We saw increased mobilization of the Black Lives Matter movement and racial justice protests around the country and around the world with concrete demands for change. We also saw increased and open public displays of emboldened white supremacy. These are 2 simultaneous trajectories that have emerged in even stronger force within the last recent weeks and days. Among theological schools, the responses also are as diverse as the many faith traditions represented among ATS schools. Almost 60% of ATS schools in the summer of 2020 made public statements about their commitments to racial justice, about the outcry over the killing of Black people. somewhere in the, and this is even to taking into account where somewhere in the neighborhood of almost 20% of the schools, of ATS schools, are not authorized by their governing or ecclesial structures to make public statements as an institution, where that might go to an ecclesial authority or a body in those cases. So that is a pretty large percentage, and it represents schools from across the ecclesial spectrum, both evangelical, mainline Protestant, and Roman Catholic and Orthodox. Now, I would also say that there are other traditions that are dealing with their own internal denominational stresses on race and racism. So in conclusion, theological schools were already in a state of profound and rapid change. These changes have only been amplified by the dual pandemics. The hope is that the renewed impetus among many schools is that they see clearer and more urgent pathways for the ways that they need to change for the benefits of their educational missions going forward in the future. The challenges, though, as I've said before, existed before these inflection points of 2020. But these changes are now under the magnifying glass or within the accelerator's churn of change facing theological schools in this decade of the 2020s. And it feels like, though we're only 2 years into it, this decade has already felt like 3 decades long. So that is our perspective of what we're seeing from the ATS side of things. And maybe that provides a context and a framework for the conversation that we want to have among this panel. How are you framing historically and theologically for your schools, trustees, faculty, staff, students, and constituencies at this time?
First of all, as with Frank, it's good to say congratulations to our dear sister and friend, Deb Krause, on her position as president of Eden. With respect, Frank, to the question that you raised, that when it comes to how we speak to our stakeholders, our constituencies, I have been very careful in reiterating, in emphasizing, stating over and over again, almost until the drumbeat has become redundant to some, the sense that it is so terribly important for us to recognize that while we are in a viral pandemic, it is essential that we recognize the intersectionality of these pandemics. We've talked about the pandemic of COVID-19, and we've talked about the pandemic of race and racism. And there is also I feel very strongly, as much the pandemic of economic injustice, which continues to drive disparity and inequity in our social fabric. And then couple that with the insurrectionist opportunism that was taken by so many as a result of burgeoning incivilities and hostilities over the course of the past year that were also prior. I am very much a fan of, there's a great theologian named Leslie Jones, who used to be on Saturday Night Live. But Leslie, she says exactly the sentiments that I hold to, which are, if you come from those communities of the oppressed, if you have been brutalized by our social order, if you understand what it means to be in search of the beloved community that is not yet, then you can appreciate Leslie's sentiment that I've always lived the pandemic life. The pandemic life is not new to many of us. It has simply become recognizable to so many more now. And as a result of that fact, we can find perhaps greater reciprocity, mutuality, respect, rapprochement in our theological work and in our social order. And I will also say how chagrined I am sometimes to hear people talk about wanting to return to normal. Not interested in normal, because normal has been what has gotten us to where we are now. Normal has brought great divides. It has demeaned people. It has brutalized people. It has cost people quite literally, from Atlanta's metro yesterday or day before now to the many lives lost by Black and Brown across this country. It is time for us to find a way that takes us beyond normalcy. And this is why we are people of faith, because as a faith community and with theological graduate seminary education, especially being able to articulate and conceptualize what it is that we think and feel and act upon, we have a great gift that we can bring to the world around us if we only believe that the innovations and creativities that are emerging from us now are ready to bear that kind of magnificent witness.
I want to ditto Alton's commendations to you, Deb, and congratulations, and just say what a pleasure it is to be here with my esteemed colleague. Let me say, I think, Frank, you hit on something, a couple of key points, and a word that I've been using and that President Ray has also been using sort of throughout this time is care. Just a simple word, but a much needed word. And so in thinking about today's conversation, I've also been thinking about what are the ways in which CTS has continued to mine its history of care. So you have an institution that was founded to train ministers, an institution that was a part of the abolitionist movement, and as a part of that training, enslaved or formerly enslaved. They weren't slaves because they didn't mentally see themselves as slaves, but they were physically enslaved. So again, institution founded on providing theological training to persons who were formerly enslaved. Also thinking about ways in which this history of care at CTS has pivoted around this kind of sociology being in conversation with theology, right? So when we talk about field ed and CPE, putting theology, sociology, and praxis in conversation, this history of care, of providing, the first seminary award to a woman, CTS, again, mining this history of care, the first to provide an honorary degree to Dr. Martin Luther King, then the height of the 50s. CTS, one of the early institutions to be a part of the March at Selma. I was on Facebook yesterday, beautiful picture of Mrs. Jessie Jackson. And so when we think of Jessie here at CTS, we can't think of Mrs. Jessie Jackson without thinking of Reverend Jessie Jackson. And the story is, again, as a part of that history of care, that when Reverend Jessie Jackson got down to Selma, who did he see? The president of CTS there as well. So how do we continue to mine this history of care, this putting sociology and theology in conversation? What does that look like in a pandemic? Well, first of all, I think as Alton and Frank also lifted, there was trauma before March 2020. There was always a pre-pandemic portrait, and it wasn't a pretty picture. So what are the ways now that we're seeing the kind of fissures and gaps? And so what have we been doing? What a part of that mining our own institution's history of care is, yes, tending to the personal care of our students. And we've noted, yes, with grants, we've noted with ways in which we've shifted funds, with even in our own institution, to establish emergency funds. So even before HERF, before the CARES Act, what are ways as an institution that we were saying, well, we're going to be responsible for caring for students and faculty and staff who may be facing these fiscal exigencies. But also a part of that care was not only just institutional, but it was communal care. We had a grant that was set up to aid congregations to provide and to address COVID. So meeting with these religious and faith leaders, again, returning to our own sort of history of care, if you will, and helping congregations to navigate this pandemic. I think thirdly, and then I'll close, how do we also provide curriculum care? So I think in many regards, we had to have more grace in the classroom. Our professors had to be pastors, rabbis, imams in the classroom. We had to rethink extensions and deadlines. And so much of our time just getting into classroom was breathing, checking in with folk. So I think on at least three different levels, as we think about CTS's own history of care and mining that history, we see ways in which institutionally, communally, but also with our curriculum, how we've had to adapt, adjust, and in many ways reinvent ourselves. We've been online since 2013, so that was easy for us. But the hard work was the work of the personal care, the communal care, and tending to, yes, the pre-pandemic stuff that is now, the scab has been pulled out, and it's the stuff under the scab that we're also seeing. And even now with the vaccine, we're still seeing the inequities as it relates to access and those who are being able to sign up to receive vaccine. So just thinking about those three levels, and again, in light of our own institution's history, how do we continue to mine and reinvent and recontextualize this history of care?
Thank you both so much, Dr. Crowder and Dr. Pollard, for those reflections. It's interesting because here in what Walter Johnson has called the broken heart of America, St. Louis, Missouri, at the crossroads of so many of those legacies and histories of oppression and of white supremacy. Eden Theological Seminary in this moment, having a new president, the opportunity and the challenge of framing for our community, our constituencies, our board of trustees, our faculty, our alumni, the network with congregations, denominations with which we are in mission. Thinking about that historical context and our geographical context has been a real opportunity and challenge for me, and a way in which, so many people have sent me commiserations this year. Oh, you're beginning as president during a pandemic, it must be so difficult. And of course, in all of the ways you have named, it is difficult. And yet it has been in some ways a tremendous blessing. Not only to be a part of a team of leaders with leaders such as Dean Niles and Dean Williams and other colleagues of ours here at the seminary, but also the sort of moment for reflecting, and that really calls us to reflect. So a point that I've taken in our context is to think about the historic situation of our move, that we are currently on our third campus, Eden Theological Seminary. We were founded in 1850 as an immigrant school of German evangelical Protestants who were a part of those big waves of immigration in the 19th century and were really fleeing European challenges, namely in Prussia around conscription into the army, and came here to North America and began farming in Missouri, chose to live in Missouri in 1850, in the middle of the 19th century, imagining they were going to be pacifists, and found themselves on the front porch of a civil war, and immediately had to take sides and work out that sort of ethical commitment of pacifism in the real lived context. And so from there really began the challenge and opportunity of this particular theological tradition in this context to respond to white supremacy and to respond to the reality of slavery in this nation. And fortunately, the evangelical Germans chose the right side and the seminary with them, and took the side of the North in the battleground state of Missouri. And that has always been framed, speaking of mining our history, Stephanie, with a kind of a heroic lens in the reflections of our theological tradition, and rightly so in many ways. Claiming firsts like, Eden Seminary is the first institution of higher learning in the state of Missouri to matriculate an African-American person. Reverend Joseph Gomez, who later became a bishop in the AME Church, is the first graduate in 1933 of Eden Theological Seminary, decades before the University of Missouri, St. Louis University, Washington University. We can pat ourselves on the back for a long time about that. And it's an important history, but it's of course always an ambivalent history as a predominantly white institution. And the framing that I've chosen to kind of respond to this moment and see the opportunities and calling for the seminary at this moment is really to the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic offered this with the ability to reflect back to 1918, 1919, 1920, in the last great global pandemic health emergency that we faced. And the seminary at that time was negotiating its move to this campus. That's also the same time historically that the Association of Theological Seminaries, as I understand it through Glenn Miller's history about the ATS, was beginning to form in meetings in Boston, Massachusetts, kind of in the break-in seasons of the pandemic. So you see seated entirely European American white male theological leaders in this photo that Glenn has in the back of that history at one of the proto meetings of the ATS. And thinking about that, the ATS is being formed, the degree of the MDiv is being kind of imagined through the Bachelor of Divinity. The profession of ministry is being standardized through the association. And for me, in my reflection and leadership at Eden, I have had to think of that in the broken heart of America as very much a part of aspirational whiteness. And the kind of embodiment of this German immigrant tradition joining this larger movement in higher education in North America that's really creating a kind of aspirational move that many, many different theological traditions were joining. And it's a complicated history, right? And how we institutionalize these things, how we are bound to this powerful phrase you used in your intro, Frank, the twisted soul at the heart of European colonialism, how that endures in the church and its institutions. And so really having this opportunity of the pandemic to reflect on that, because a huge challenge Eden Seminary faces is our always overbuilt, never sustainable for the last 100 years, at first 26-acre and now 18-acre campus. And so seeing this beautiful heritage we have, but also understanding its conscription into this history and coming to terms with that, coming to both an appreciation and a deeper understanding of what it all means, what our tower, which is modeled on the Magdalen College tower at Oxford University, says in this move that was being architecturally built into the imagination of the church. And if this is our history as a theological school, then it is the history of the congregations and communities that we are in association with and connected to. We all have this need right now to think about our buildings and how they're a part of this history, to think about how we've been not just our buildings, but how we've been formed, how we think of the curriculum in this regard. What is the MDiv in light of these legacies and histories? And it's been a powerful opportunity to think about all of this in conversation with the Board of Trustees, with the faculty, under the leadership of our wonderful deans and the staff, to really take this moment to think about how we have the opportunity to really reflect and dig deeply and think about where we are and why we're here, and what our calling is in light of all of these legacies and histories.
And that's a really wonderful segue too, as was Dean Crowder's comments about the care aspects, about how these messages, how these reframings at the various levels and with the different constituencies actually becomes programmatic, right? So, this has been both a time of innovation and adaptation for theological schools. So I'd love to hear from the deans in terms of what forms of theological education that you find that you and your faculties are adapting to and developing in this time of the twin pandemics.
So it is a pleasure for me to be here, and thank you for the invitation to participate. So at this particular time in our history, the pandemic, as everyone knows, has been tragic in so many ways, and the sense of loss that so many people are experiencing in our world is profound, and the ramifications of it are going to be far-reaching. And but then at the same time, it has presented us opportunities that we probably would not have had, at least not presented to us in the way that it is right now. And so with those opportunities, it is incumbent upon us to walk into them. Before the pandemic, we were a 100% face-to-face teaching institution. Stephanie Crowder talked about they had been doing online education since 2013. It's like no such thing at Louisville Seminary. And so it was, we had to, within a 2-week period over our research and study week, switch from being 100% face-to-face to teaching 100% online. That's a huge shift. And our faculty made the shift. And what we want to do now with this opportunity that we've been presented is to build on that and to continue to learn how to do this well. And then we'll be having in the fall conversations about what kind of models for delivery of theological education make the most sense for us. And this is a conversation that we must have as a community. And so we'll be surveying our constituencies. We'll be surveying alumni. We'll be surveying current students. We haven't asked people in a while what they need from us. And it's like, imagine that, right? So we're an institution of theological education, and we've not really asked our constituency in a while, what do you need? What kind of knowledge and skills do your leaders need, your pastoral leaders, your lay leaders, to do the work that you feel called to do? So we're going to do that. And I think that's exciting, upgrading our technology, of course, of racism, as has been said so many times here, is not new. Louisville Seminary has been an epicenter for this, with Breonna Taylor being killed in her own home in Louisville last year. And so our students have been pushing us. If they say we have committed last year as a seminary, or actually in 2019, we committed to teaching our students to being anti-racist. It's our quality enhancement plan with SAC-COC. And our students have been pushing us to live into that. And so we are working on that in some substantive ways. We have a committee through the Wabash Symposium and Embedded Committee that's looking at every area of our seminary for policies, practices, and procedures that bear any residue of racism. We have to examine that. Louisville has been around for a long time. There's a lot of practices and procedures we've probably gotten used to that probably need to go or to be changed. And so we're doing that work now. And we also, one of the things that has come to the fore is that even though we've been having conversations about being anti-racist and looking at our curriculum and so many other parts of our seminary in so many ways, we have never taught our faculty how to facilitate difficult conversations about race in the classroom. And this has come to our attention even in a more profound way during this particular period in our history. So we want to do the work so that every faculty member feels like he, she, they are equipped in the classroom when these difficult conversations happen in the classroom, that they can handle them. We don't have to ignore it or hope that it goes away. If we really are serious about being anti-racist, then we have to hit it head on. So these are a few things that we're doing in addition to just making sure that issues of justice in general during the pandemic don't kind of get left behind in our desire to become more technologically savvy or anything of that nature. So I feel that it is a very exciting time for us. And I am very, very hopeful that coming out of this pandemic, that we will continue to ask questions and to shift and change to meet the needs of the people that we are serving.
I think at CTS, we're approaching this a couple of different ways. I think number one, when we think of, part of this whole pre-pandemic, not so pretty portrait has been the economic inequity and the fiscal imbalance. And so we talked some about that. What does that look like in our seminaries? What does that look like when students are walking in the door with debt and we're adding on debt? So what do we do as we address retention, persistence, and completion, and particularly the fiscal challenges related to that? So I think there, as care, how do we think about the financial care, institutionally? So part of what we've been doing is, for many, the MDiv has, had its day, its heyday. And so how do we begin to think in earnest about micro-credentialing? So how do we work with ordination bodies to say, that if students take these sets of courses, can we come to some agreement that yes, these students will then be prepared for ministry in whatever form that will be. So we're really having these earnest conversations. Yes, we still have students who are applying to our MDiv program, but also offering alternative, shorter paths for the sake of, yes, ordination, meeting needs, but also being good stewards of finances. The ATS lets us know, Dr. Yamada, what the loan aspects are, and it's painful to see that. Even having conversations with, our PhD committee, these cost a lot of money. Do we really, really need to admit more students when I think many of us saw the ARSBL FY20 jobs report, 17% down. So these kinds of conversations around micro-credentialing. But I think also conversations around micro-credentialing and also boosting our certificates as well. We have certificates in interreligious engagement, LGBTQIA studies, in chaplaincy studies. Again, shorter, quicker, but yet still powerful opportunities for us to engage sociology with theology. Also thinking of a way in which here in Chicago, the mayor's getting a lot of flack because she's kind of pro-police, but yet people are supporting her because she's the first, LGBTQIA representative. So this kind of walking the fine line, if you will. And if it is our mission, to transform leaders who will, educate society for a greater justice and mercy, then what does that mean then, as far as our providing means and opportunities to sojourn with activists? Activists who want and may need some degree of theological training and undergirding. So again, if our history is, as far as our abolitionist proclivities and practices, how do we use that now in light of the ways in which the pandemics are revealing all of these multi-tiered and multi-layered inequities? So I think that's one of the things that's happening with us, that in light of the whole fiscal challenges, but also in light of ways in which we're thinking of how can we continue to marry social activism with theology.
What we are seeing as we turn into the fall and into the future, we, like Louisville, have been an always on residential campus, dorms, rooms, the whole works. Everybody's online, is on board on campus. Many of us live right here on campus. But now it is clear that blended classes, because of the pandemic and because of people's needs, have changed our reality. And the thinking about blended classes, one of the points that have come up and we're talking about is, how do you have egalitarian teaching in a blended space? It's fine and good to have people on screens around the room, but particularly in classes where discussion is part of it, if you're actually only attending a TED Talk on screen while the others are in relationship in the room, that's not egalitarian. So what does it mean to privilege the people who are distant so they are equal to the people that are in the room? Those are the conversations we're trying to figure out. And this is not just classroom, but because we do still see ourselves as a residentially forming community. What does it mean to be in class, in chapel, in the hallways, in the dining room with distant colleagues? This is the grace of the moment. The Spirit is teaching us to be different for an egalitarian learning environment. And I think that's important. The other piece is pedagogies that work with healthy teaching. If Paulo Freire has not been true, he now comes true with a vengeance, that bank model won't work, because if you try and keep a poor student online for 3+ hours, if you keep yourself online for 3+ hours, I don't know about you, but my eyes hurt, let alone my throat and my concentration at looking at all the Brady Bunch squares. So what does it mean to do healthy teaching? And as a theologian, I'm not apologetic. Health is the definition of soterios, salvation. So what is it to do salvific teaching and salvific learning in this new space? I think those are both important. And to talk about teaching that is healthy, holistic, it takes us into the conversation about the other tyranny that we have lived with for lifetimes. May I say, it's very nice to be with these kinds of faces in a room in leadership. It makes my heart happy. What does it mean to be teachers with the plurality of sources of knowledge? So what does it mean to hear, so we keep saying for our accreditation that we're multicultural. Are we? Or are we making sure we have a bunch of people of different ethnicities in a room, teachers and students. Those are different things. What does it mean to actually farm the wisdom of the Asian American, Africans, African Americans, Latinx traditions? What does it mean to farm the wisdom of Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism? Those are sources of wisdom. And how do we as teachers learn to look at them and bring them to the way we teach in our being? The other source of knowledge is our students themselves. If we're going to have andragogies rather than pedagogies, then we must know that our students have wisdom and they change the game. And so every time you teach a class, even if it's the same course, you teach a completely different course. That wisdom needs to come into the conversation. But while we're doing that, we mustn't move to a meritocracy for privileging a particular knowledge over everyone else, whether it be gender, race, or discipline. Because X was the most oppressed, we will now make that the most important. Then we've learned nothing. I keep telling my peers, I don't want to know about how somebody is oppressed. I want to know about the wisdom that we have failed to hear from them. And I do not want to play the Olympics of oppression. I want to talk about the plurality that is so enriching our spaces. These are the sources from which we teach and learn.
At all times, I really want to keep the student in the forefront, right? So often theological education, we are giving the answers, right? We are constructing this piece to make it right, to produce a piece, to give away. But just what would happen if we turned it inside out, much like what Dean Niles is saying, and saying that there is some information, there is some wisdom, there is some sagely wisdom that is beyond the walls, right? And so at some point, we have to begin to look at where is the church, where is the people, where is the community? And I don't know about you, but I'm believing that the answer is within the community. And so it's much like when we go to the doctor, and we go to the doctor because our knees are hurting. I might be talking about myself. But the doctor says, let me give you a Tylenol because more than likely your head hurt because you've had a hard week. Well, that doctor didn't give me the opportunity to express my ailments, to express my needs, to express the pain and the grief that is causing some of this pain. So too often we are looking at surface levels in order to create a box to give to someone. And so much of our pain is because of the trauma. Dean Mumford talked about the grief. Well, that grief extends beyond and it goes deep. So, whether it's the legacies of grief, the Jim Crow, whether it's lynching, or whether it's Sandra Bland. I have moved from South Florida here to St. Louis, and I tell you what, I drive differently knowing that it's a police officer behind me, right? Other day, I'm driving down the highway, and my spouse started moving and stuff. I said, oh no, I said, stay still, right? Because I carry with me the legacies of grief. And so if I am experiencing that, then it is that is coming into the classroom. It is that must be integrated into the curriculum, into the assignments, into the awareness of what is really going on. And so at Eden, a lot of people say, oh, well, there's Sonia again. She's the dreamer. Well, yes, I am going to dream. I'm going to dream big because I am also wanting for us to produce a sense of hope. I want us to be able to find those places of gratitude. I'm believing that hope is possible at the intersections, right? And so we have to talk about that. We have to move away from just these binary spaces, but indeed talk about the places that bring about grief. The things we have to talk about trauma. Dean Crowder talked about that. as well, right? So what is trauma? So I don't know how often we are actually taking the time to define what trauma is. How has trauma impacted us? How does it show up? How do we view it? And how do we see that trauma in the other? Right? And so we cannot allow spaces to be in the classroom where we're showing up and people are dismissing our trauma, where people are saying, oh, going back to the Olympics of oppression that Dean now spoke about, it's not that, because the hope is bringing all of those into that space to then discuss it, twirl it around, put it at play. I'm a practical theologian, so you got to put those pieces together to then create something new so that we can look at the horizon and create and make something beautiful. So at all times, we have to consider the student. And so the students now, I'm looking at our population now, considering that we've been around since 1850, predominantly white population. Well, now with this increase of students, we are now at 50-50, black and white, right? And so that changes the dynamics of a lot, right? That changes what you teach, that changes the perspective and how we witness and give and receive. And I think the theological education has to remember that it's not all about giving, but it might just be about the collaboration and the creating together to then produce something, to then create the beloved community, to then do and create and form and imagine what might be possible. We also talk about that theological imagination piece. Well, I'm going to add another word in front of that. Maybe it's the black imagination that also has to come into these spaces to create something that has not been heard before. All right, I'm going to sit down now because I got excited. I like this piece when I get to talk.
Oh, I feel like we're at church. Hey, we're having church here. Thank you, Dean Williams. I'm mindful of something that we've been calling in ATS buildings like COVID time. It's this really odd mix of how fast the months go and how slow the minutes go. But this is one of those really kind of thin moments where it feels like time is seeming a little more timeless for me. Because I think what we're capturing in this panel is I'm hearing these broad themes of really broad, very, very different institutions. And before I even go on about the differences in the institutions, if I could just name just the significance of this moment where we have senior level administrators, the majority of whom in this panel are people of color, serving historically white institutions. This signals a new day. And to reflect on your phrase, President Pollard, I hope that we don't return to normal, not just in the appearance of what's on this panel, but in the ways that I hear each of your institutions seeking to live faithfully into this moment. And just one brief biblical reflection. What strikes me in this moment is the book of Ruth. So the book starts and it's a period of famine. This is the famine that has always existed in some ways from time immemorial, that we are people who are used to living in famine. And in fact, that's really the story of Ruth and Naomi, is how they not only survive, but how they transform and thrive through their relationship with each other, in the middle, to give them not only their people, but their families and to each other a future through chesed, through their love and faithfulness to each other. As my Dr. Mutter used to say, the faithfulness in action, the chesed. But this is what I hear in all of us, how we can live into this moment, transforming the institutions of which we serve and to which we have been called. And it's just an amazing array of faithful actions and steps that each of you are taking from your different locations and places.